Hi, guys. Welcome to Esther Lesson 2, Chapters 3 and 4. Before we get started on Chapter 3, I just wanted to do a really quick review because Chapter 3 starts with the phrase after these events. Now, after what events? Well, after the king displayed all his riches and his splendor with these two big banquets. After he called for Queen Vashti to display her beauty, and she was like, no. After she was removed as queen, and then this edict went out that all women needed to respect their husbands and that their husband's word was now law. So then all these beautiful virgins, if you remember, were brought to the king. And, this really got me to thinking, do you think Esther was the only Jewish woman brought before the king? Because I don't think so. Now, we're not told, but there were probably hundreds and hundreds of these women who came because they were coming from 127 different provinces. So there was more than just a couple or just a little handful of these women. So she couldn't have been the only Jew. So I wonder if everyone else's family kind of gave them the same advice that, hey, don't let them know that you're a Jew. But we just don't know. Well, Esther, we know, with her one night with the king, was very loved, and he favored her over all the others and made her queen. And then he threw a banquet. Now, Mordecai overheard this plot to kill the king while he was sitting outside of the temple gate, and he reported it back to Esther. Now, Esther went and told the king, and she made very clear that it was Mordecai who had overheard this, and really Mordecai who had saved the king's life. So Mordecai's name was written in the king's chronicles, in the history books. So how long kind of in chapter 3 after these events took place does chapter 3 actually begin? It's about 5 years later. So between chapters 1 and 2, we have 4 years. And now between 2 and 3, we have 5 years. So this is about 8 years after Queen Vashti was deposed. And now Esther has been queen for about 5 years. We're looking at around roughly 473 BC. And we're introduced to another main character by the name of Haman. Now, Haman, we don't know anything really about him. We don't know what he was doing with the king, what kind of arrangement or what kind of things kind of prompted the king to promote Haman, but we know that he did. He promoted him above everyone else, all of the other princes in all of the 127 provinces, and made him essentially second in command. And then he went a step further and he commanded that everyone bow. Now, we're not talking a cute little, Queen of England bow or a sweet little curtsy. This bow is prostrate, face down, flat out, on the ground in a very submissive position. Now, here's a $2,400 question. What other word is actually used for that position, that laying face down and that submissive position? Do you know? It's the same word as worship. So Haman would pass by the gate where Mordecai was, and Mordecai would just sit there, watch him go, and he flat out refused to bow. Now, when the men were like, hey, this is the king's command, how come you're not bowing before Haman? In verse 4 it tells them, because he was a Jew. So look at how Haman was described, because every time I hear this, which is not very often, preached, everybody that I've ever heard is like, well, because he was a Jew and he wasn't going to worship anyone besides the one true God. And while that's very true, there is a deeper reason why Mordecai would not bow before Haman. And it's found in verse 1 and verse 10 of chapter 3. It says that Haman was an Agagite. He was an enemy of the Jews. Now, we're not going to go into a whole lot of what that meant to be an Agagite or what that meant to be an Amalekite or an enemy of the Jew, because we're going to go into this in great detail when we meet the very last week of April. So after Lamentations in March, after Kinsman Redeemer in April, when we come together to have our potluck dinner, we're going to learn about this spirit of Amalek. But I do want to mention a couple things just so we understand where Haman and the Jewish people stand at this point. Way back in the book of Exodus, chapter 17, when the Jewish people were coming out of Egypt, Amalek actually attacked them, totally unprovoked. The Israelites weren't doing anything. They just were trying to get to where God wanted them to go, and he attacked them. So Joshua actually led Israel against the Amalekites and won. But God was going to take it a step further, and he said he would have war with Amalek from generation to generation because he wanted Amalek's memory absolutely blotted out. Then in Numbers 24, we see Balaam, he was the guy with the donkey who started talking to him, prophesied that Israel's king and kingdom would be exalted over Agag. Now, Balaam was actually an ally of Agag in the beginning. So that caused a little bit of tension. Then in 1 Samuel 15, Saul, the king of Israel at that time, was told by God to utterly destroy Amalek. And God said he wanted to punish Amalek for what he did to Israel way back in Exodus chapter 17. Well, Saul didn't listen. Instead, he brought Amalek back in a cage and started to parade the man around. So the prophet Samuel confronted Saul about his disobedience and went and killed Amalek himself. So Saul and his descendants lost the kingdom. This was the last straw as far as God was concerned. So look at what Haman's reaction was. Talk about a drama king, right? He totally overreacted to Mordecai's refusal. He didn't go and tell the king. He didn't have Mordecai punished or demand that he follow the king's laws. So he was enraged. He not only wanted to destroy Mordecai, he wanted to destroy every Jew in the entire kingdom, in all 127 provinces. Now, this actually has a word. It's called a pogrom, a Pogrom, one word. And its formal kind of definition is an organized massacre of helpless people under circumstances of cruelty. However, throughout history and traditionally, it refers to violent attacks on Jewish people, specifically Jewish people, by non-Jewish populations. Now, in history, there were about 20 pogroms. Some lasted many years. The first recorded one, which really surprised me, was not until 38 AD. And the last one was recorded in October 7th of 2023, when Hamas went in and their intention was to utterly destroy all of the Jews who lived in Gaza. And there are still people today who are their hostages. And many of the Israeli soldiers have been killed in this skirmish trying to get their people back. So in verses 7 through 11, Haman decided what day, this day of annihilation, this pogrom was going to occur, and he did it literally with the roll of a dice. It's a pur or a lot, and the plural of pur is purim or Purim, which is the name of the holiday or the feast. In Proverbs 16:33, it tells us that people cast lots, but God decides where it lands. Now, when you look at verse 7, you could actually read that one of two ways. You could either read it as Haman rolled that pur every day for an entire year and said, well, not today. Oh, not today. Oh, not today. For an entire year, which is a crazy waste of time. Or you could read it as he went through the calendar very systematically. In our vernacular, it would be, is it going to happen in January? No. Is it going to happen in February? No. Until they got all the way to the 12th month. And then once it got to the 12th month, it went, oh, it's going to be Adar. Okay. Now we have to go through and, oh, is it day 1? No. Oh, is it day 2? All the way till he got to the 12th day. Now, I think that's how he actually did it, but it still took a ridiculously long time to figure this out. So now Haman knows the day, the mighty her have spoken. And now he knows. So he's got to go to the king, because Haman can't go and decide to just go killing off a bunch of people. So he went to the king. And he told the king that these people he wanted to wipe out were people who subverted the king's laws. He never mentioned that they were Jews. He never even told the king that it was only one people group or one nationality that he decided to annihilate. Why? Why do you think he kind of conveniently left that out? Maybe because the king would ask him why. And he'd actually have to admit that one of them made me mad. And that would just seem really goofy. And so the king wouldn't, it'd be out of his mind to kill a whole group of people who weren't really doing anything wrong just because he was mad with one person who really didn't do anything wrong either. So he didn't tell him. He just said, there's these people who are completely disobedient to your laws. And then he went a step further and he offered to pay every human being 10,000 talents, a ridiculously huge amount of money, to anybody who agreed to help the king. The king agreed. Now, when Haman approached the king, what did the king not do that he'd always done before? The king never asked for anybody's advice. He never went to his wise men. Well, why not? Because he trusted Haman. The moral of this interaction, this little exchange, is be really careful who you choose as your second. In chapter 1, verses 19 and 21, and then again in chapter 2, verses 4 and 9, and we'll see it again and again, we see this phrase, pleased the king. However, in chapter 3, look who else was pleased. Haman. Now, the king, Xerxes, didn't actually make this edict. He gave his signet ring to Haman, which was giving him all of his authority, and told Haman to go ahead and write whatever he wanted. So on the 13th day of the first month, Haman dictated to the king's scribes exactly what he wanted to happen. Now, this then had to go out in all of the different languages to 127 provinces on donkey, horseback, foot, whatever. It was going to take a long time. So it wasn't going to happen until the 12th day of the 12th month that every Jew would be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. This is a pogrom. So they had 11 months to send out all these letters and for these people to prepare for the absolute destruction of the Jewish people. If you look in verse 15, there's this insane contrast. Because sitting in Susa, Haman and the king were just drinking. They were having their merry old good time. And in the city of Susa, who would have gotten the edict first, since that's where it originated, was an absolute chaotic confusion. Now, you got to wonder, why didn't these Jewish people just run off to Jerusalem? Why didn't they go back and just get out of there all the way around? Well, the problem was this edict would have affected the people, the Jews who had gone home. Because since the time of Cyrus, Jerusalem was actually part of the Medo-Persian Empire. And if you remember last week, enemies had already written to Xerxes, and then later his son, Artaxerxes, to try to stop these people from rebuilding the temple and rebuilding Jerusalem. Now, beginning of chapter 4, we see who was part of this insane confusion in Susa. It was Mordecai. And he was wailing. He was in sackcloth and ashes. He was sitting at the gate. This would have been a very, very public display of emotion. And we know that the other Jews throughout the kingdom, when they found out, they also went into great mourning with fasting and weeping and wailing and sackcloth and ashes. I mean, can you imagine what they would have been feeling when they read this edict? I mean, there's absolutely nothing that says that the Jews who stayed behind in Babylon were anything but assimilated. They weren't some big army planning to overthrow the king. These people had friends and extended families. I mean, most likely they had intermarried with other nationalities in the kingdom. So how exactly is a Jew going to be defined? And if you are a Jew, how do you trust your neighbors and your friends or your own family or in-laws? I mean, people will do some crazy, unheard things for the kind of money that Haman was actually offering. This would have been an absolute 11 months of turmoil and chaos and fear. But you know who hadn't heard about this edict? Esther, the queen in the castle. And we know that because when she saw Mordecai in sackcloth, she sent clothes to him. She wanted him to come inside because if you remember, nobody in sackcloth and ashes was allowed to go into the king's palace. And she probably really needed him to come inside and to talk to him and to find out why in the world he was in sackcloth, what he was mourning about. And to do that, he had to be dressed. But Mordecai refused the clothes. He told the messenger, Hadak, about Haman's plan to destroy the Jews. And just in case there was any confusion, he sent a copy of it to Esther. He said, Esther, you need to plead with the king for the life of your people. And Esther said, gosh, Uncle Mordecai, the king hasn't even summoned me for 30 days. I haven't even seen the man. If I go into him and he hasn't summoned me, I could be killed unless he extended out his scepter. So, I mean, she was very rightly scared and conflicted. I mean, she wanted to save her people, but she didn't want to die. And really, what good would it have done her people had she gone in to talk to the king and the king didn't raise a scepter and she died anyway? Then who in the world was going to speak up for her people? I mean, I think we find ourselves in similar situations all the time. We want to speak out against the godlessness of our society and maybe even in our own families, but we don't want to suffer any negative consequences. So typically, we just find an excuse and we don't say anything. Then Mordecai gives an absolute beautiful, be a pretty forceful response. He tells her, look, if you stay silent and the Jews are destroyed, being the queen is not going to save you. And up to this point, does anybody know she's a Jew? Not at all. So how did Mordecai think that she'd actually be discovered? We don't know. But he told her, when you die, your father's entire bloodline is going to be gone. You're all there is. And if you don't do this, relief and deliverance for the Jews is going to come. This won't come from you. That's a very bold statement of faith that Mordecai makes. How does he know they're going to be delivered if Esther's not the one that does it? Mordecai would have known the Abrahamic covenant. He would have known that God promised Abraham to a great nation, many, many offspring, and to be in the land of Israel forever. He would have also known about Jeremiah. He prophesied in Jerusalem before and after the exile, who also spoke of a renewed covenant with Israel. And Ezekiel prophesied in Babylon. He was taken with Mordecai's great-grandfather during that second siege by Nebuchadnezzar. He would have known about God's everlasting covenant of peace when he gathers his people back from the nations and sanctifies them. So Mordecai's last point to Esther is this: who's to say that you haven't attained royalty for such a time as this? Maybe these last 5 years, these 6 years with your beautification, these last 8 years, your entire life, the whole reason I wasn't sent back to Jerusalem and God really put it in my heart to stay here. Maybe that entire lifetime that we've lived here in Susa was done for this time right here, for this very reason. Well, that got to Esther's heart, because she told him to assemble all the Jews in Susa and to fast and to pray for her for 3 days. And that she and all of her maids, which we don't know if they were Jewish or not, but they were going to fast and they were going to pray for 3 days. And at the end of 3 days, she would go to the king. And if she died, she died. She was willing to lay down her life for her people. In Mark chapter 8, verses 34 through 38, we're told that we need to deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow him. And anyone who loses their life for his sake gains it. That denies yourself actually means to disown or denounce yourself and subjugate everything, your work, your deeds, your interests, your enjoyment, all to him. You totally submit to God by denouncing yourself. It's to take on this attitude of, if God's not in it, I don't want it. And to take up your cross doesn't mean that you're taking up this horrible burden. It represents death, yes, but it's death to self and freedom in him. It's an exchange of your old self for your new self. We're buried with Christ to rise and walk in newness of life. It's an exchange. It's covenant language. And to lose your life for his sake, that doesn't mean that you're going to die for him. It actually means you lose your will. You lose your worldliness, that heart of stone. And instead you raise a banner, a declaration, a confession of him by the way that you live. Well, that's actually all I have for lesson 2. If you have any questions or comments, be sure to put them in the comments down below this video. Let me know that you saw it, that you watched it. Let me know what you're thinking so far. And next week, we will be right back here at the same time studying Esther, lesson 3. So until then, Shavua Tov, have a great week. Shalom.